Disclaimer: this book may contain content that is considered historically inaccurate or culturally insensitive by modern standards. My hope is that by exploring old literature, we will better understand why people of the past thought the way that they did and understand the influences that shape their culture. This video is not intended for young audiences. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I'm excited to read to you from Out of Door Book, which is the 7th book in a series or collection of books called The Children's Hour, which were published by Houghton Mifflin Co. in 1907. The Steeple-Climber by Cleveland Moffett. 1. In which we make the acquaintance of Steeple Bob. During the summer months of 1900, what blazing hot months to be sure! People on Lower Broadway were constantly coming upon other people with chins in the air, staring up and exclaiming, "Dear me, isn't it wonderful?" Or, "There's that fellow again, I'm sure he'll break his neck." Then they would pass on and give place to other wonderers. The occasion of this general surprise and apprehension was a tall man, dressed entirely in white, who appeared day after day, swinging on a little seat far up the side of this or that church steeple, or right at the top, hugging the gold cross or weather vane, or, higher still, working his way, with a queer, kicking, hitching movement, up various 100-foot flagpoles that rise from the heaven-challenging office buildings down near Wall Street. At these perilous altitudes, he would hang for hours, shifting his ropes occasionally, raising his swing or lowering it, but not doing anything that his sidewalk audience could see very well or clearly understand. Yet thousands watched him with fascination, and a Kodak army descended upon neighboring house steps, and newspapers followed the movements of Steeple Bob in thrilling chronicle. That is what he was called in large black letters at the head of columns, Steeple Bob. But I came to know him at his modest quarters on Lexington Avenue, where he was plain Mr. Merrill, a serious-mannered and unpretentious young man, very fond of his wife and his dog, very fond of spending evenings over books of adventure, and quite indifferent to his daytime notoriety. I call him a young man, yet in years of service, not in age. He is the oldest steeple-climber in the business, ever since his teacher, Steeple Charlie, fell from his swing some years ago in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and died the steeple-climber's death. I often saw books of the sea on Merrill's table and accounts of whaling voyages, and he told me one evening, while through an open door came the snores of his wary partner, about his own adventurous boyhood, with 3 years' cruising in Uncle Sam's Navy on the school ships Minnesota and Yantic. He shipped at the age of 12, and 2 years at whale fishing in the North Sea. Quite ideal training, this, for a steeple-climber. He learned to handle ropes and make them fast so they would stay. He learned to climb and keep his head at the top of a swaying masthead. He learned to bear exposure as lads must, who are washed on deck every morning with a hose, and stand for inspection, winter and summer, bare to the waist. And he gained strength of arm and back, swinging at the oar, while whale lines strained on the sunk harpoon, and patience in long stern chases, and nerve when some stricken monster lashed the water in agony, and the boat danced on a reddened sea. Merrill laughed about the climb up Old Trinity Spire, the first climb when he carried up the hauling rope and worked his way clear to the cross, with nothing to help him but the hands and feet he was born with, and did it coolly, while men on the street below turned away sickened with fear for him. "I'm telling you the truth," said Steeple Bob, "when I say it was an easy climb. Any fairly active man could do it if he'd forget the height. I'm not talking about all steeples. Some are hard and dangerous, but the one on Trinity, in spite of its 300-odd feet, has knobs of stone for ornament all the way up. They call them corbels, and all you have to do is to step from one to another." "How much of a step?" "Oh, when I stood on one, the next one came to my breast, and then I could just touch the one above that. He called this easy climbing. The only ticklish bit was just at the top, where 2 great stones, weighing about a ton apiece, swell out like an apple on a stick, and I had to crawl around over that apple, which was 4 feet or so across. If it hadn't been for grooves and scroll work in the stone, I couldn't have done it, and even as it was, I had 2 or 3 minutes of hard wriggling after I kicked off with my feet and began pulling myself up." "You mean you hung by your hands from this big ball of stone?" "I hung most mostly by my fingers. The scrolls weren't deep enough for my hands to go in. And you drew yourself slowly up and around and over that ball? Certainly, that was the only way. And it was at the very top? Yes, just under the cross. It wasn't much, though. You could do it yourself. I really think Merrill believed this. He honestly saw no particular danger in that climb, nor could I discover that he ever saw any particular danger in anything he had done. He always made the point that if he had really thought the thing dangerous, he wouldn't have done it, and I conclude from this that being a steeple-climber depends quite as much upon how a man thinks as upon what he can do. A funny thing happened, he added. After I got over this hard place, I slid into a V-shaped space between the bulging stone and the steeple shaft, and I lay there on my back for a minute or so, resting. But when I started to raise myself, I found my weight had worked me down in the crotch and jammed me fast, and it was quite a bit of time before I could get free. How much time? A minute? Yes, 5 minutes, and it seemed a good deal longer. 5 minutes struggling in a sort of stone trap, stretched out helpless at the very top of the steeple, where one false move would mean destruction. That is what Merrill spoke of as a funny thing? Thanks, I thought. I will take my fun some other way, and lower down. You would be surprised, he went on, to feel the movement of a steeple. It trembles all the time, and answers every jar on the street below. I guess old Trinity's steeple sways 18 inches every time an elevated train passes, and St. Paul's is even worse. Why, she rocks like a beautifully balanced cradle. It would make some people seasick. Perhaps you don't know it, but the better a steeple is built, the more she sways. You want to look out for the ones that stand rigid. There is something wrong with them. Most likely they're out of plumb. Isn't there danger, I asked, that a steeple may get swaying too much, say in a gale, and go clear over? Gale or not, said Merrill, a well-made steeple must rock in the wind, the same as a tree rocks. That is the way it takes the storm, by yielding to it. If it didn't yield, it would probably break. Why? The great shaft of the Washington Monument sways 4 or 5 feet when the wind blows hard. Then he explained that modern steeples are built with a steel backbone, if I may so call it, running down from the top many feet inside the stonework. At Trinity, for instance, this backbone, known as a dowel, is 4 inches thick and 45 feet long, a great steel mast stretching down through the cross. Down inside the heavy stones and ornaments, and ending in massive beams and braces where the steeple's greater width gives full security. What sort of work did you do on these steeples? I asked. All kinds. Stonemason's work, painter's work, blacksmith's work, carpenter's work. Why, a good steeple-climber has to know something about most every trade. It's painting flagpoles, and scraping off shale from a steeple's sides, and repairing loose stones and ornaments, and putting up lightning rods, and gilding crosses, and cleaning smokestacks so high that it makes you dizzy to look up, let alone looking down, and a dozen other things. Sometimes we have to take a whole steeple down, beginning at the top, stone by stone, unless it's a wooden steeple, and then we burn her down 5 or 6 feet at a time, with creosote painted around where you want the fire to stop. The creosote puts it out. Once I blew off the whole top of a steeple with dynamite, and, by the way, I'll tell you about that sometime. Conversing with a steeple-climber, when he feels like telling things, is like breathing oxygen. You find it overstimulating. In 10 minutes of matter-of-fact talking, he opens so many vistas of thrilling interest that you stand before them bewildered. He starts to answer one question, and you burn to interrupt him with 10 others, each of which will lead you hopelessly away from the remaining 9. Did you ever have any experiences with lightning? I asked Merrill one day. Oh, a few, he said. A thunderbolt struck the Trinity steeple the very day we finished our work. We had just taken down our tackle and staging after gilding the crosswind. By the way, they say there's $100 in gold under that cross. Really? I exclaimed. How did it get there? Somebody ordered it put there when the steeple was built. People often do queer things like that. I painted a flagpole on a barn up in Massachusetts where there was $400 in gold hidden under the weather vane. Everybody knew it was there because the farmer who put it there told everybody, and my partner was crazy to saw off the end of that pole some night and fool them, but of course I wouldn't have it. Here was I quite off my thunderbolt trail, and although curious about that farmer, I came back to it resolutely. Well, resumed Merrill, this lightning stroke came down the new rod all right until it reached the bell deck, and there it circled round and round the steeple 4 or 5 times, wrapping my assistant in bluish-white flame. Then it took a long jump straight down Wall Street, smashed a flagpole to slivers, and vanished. Say, there are things about lightning I've never heard explained. I know of a steeple-climber, for instance, who was killed by lightning. It must have been lightning, although no one saw it strike. There were two of them working on a scaffolding when a thunderstorm came up, and this man's partner started for the ground, as climbers with any sense always do. But this fellow was lazy or out of sorts of it, or something, and said he wouldn't go down. He'd stay on the steeple until the storm was over. And he did stay there, without getting any harm, so far as anybody on the ground could see, except a wetting. Just the same, when his partner went up again, he found him stretched out on the scaffolding, dead. Frightened to death? I suggested. Merrill shook his head. No, they said it was lightning. But it's queer how lightning could kill a man without being seen, isn't it? Then Merrill gave an experience of his own with a thunderbolt. It was during the same busy summer of 1900, while he and his partner were scraping the great steel smokestack that rises from ground to roof along one side of the American Tract Society building, that towering structure which looks down with contempt, no doubt, upon ordinary church steeples. We were in our saddles, Merrill explained, swung down about 2/3 of the smokestack's length, when some black clouds warned us of danger, and we hauled ourselves up to the roof. My partner, Walter Tiggy, got off his saddle and stood there where my wife was waiting. She often goes to climbing jobs with me. She's less anxious when she can watch me. But I thought the storm was passing over, and kept on scraping, sort of half resting on the cornice, half on my saddle. Suddenly, a bolt shot down from a little pink cloud just overhead, and splintered a big flagpole I had just put halyards on, and then jumped past us all so close that it knocked Walter over and made me sick and giddy, so that I fell back limp on my saddleboard and swung there helpless until my wife pulled the trip rope that opens the lock block and drew me in from the edge. That's not the first time she's been on deck at the right minute. Once she came up at steeple to tell me something, and found the hauling line smoldering from my helper's cigarette. If that line had burned through, it would have dropped me to the ground from the steeple top, saddle, lock block, and all. The man with the cigarette was so scared he quit smoking for good and all. Here, in reply to my question, Merrill explained the working of a lock block, which is simply a pulley that allows a rope to pass through it, but will not let it go back. With this block, the steeple-climber can be hauled up easily, but cannot fall, even if the man hauling should let go the rope. When it is necessary to descend, a pull on the trip rope releases a safety catch, and the saddle goes down. Do steeple-climbers always work in pairs? I asked him. Usually, it would be hard for one man to do a steeple alone. There are lots of places where you must have someone to fasten a rope, or hold the end of a plank, or pass you something. Besides, it wouldn't be good for a man's mind to be spending days and days upon steeples all alone. It's bad enough with a partner to talk to. That makes me think of poor old Dan O'Brien. If I hadn't been up with him one day. Merrill checked himself and changed the subject. I'll give you a case where a man alone could never have done the thing. I don't care how clever a steeple-climber he might be. It was on St. Paul's, New York, after we had finished the job and taken everything down. Then somebody noticed that the weather vane on top of the ball wasn't turning properly. I knew in a minute what the matter was. It was easy enough to fix it, but the thing was to reach the weather vane. I don't mean that the climb up the steeple was anything. We had done that before. But if I tried to climb around that big ball again, it was the same sort of wriggling business as that over the bulging stones at Trinity. I would be sure to scrape off a lot of the fine gilding we had just put on. And yet I couldn't get at the weather vane without getting over the ball. I studied quite a while on this little problem, and solved it with my partner's help. We both climbed the steeple as far as the ball. We went up the lightning rod, then we roped ourselves on the steeple shaft by lifelines, and then my partner, that was Joe Lawler, stood on my shoulders and did the job. You see, it was easy enough that way. Easy enough? Think of it, 2 men clinging to the point of a steeple. One of them braces himself with the toes of his rubber shoes and crannies of the stone, and the other, balancing on his shoulders like a circus performer, does a piece of work, no matter what, with a reeling abyss all around. What is looking over a precipice compared to this? And all the time the spire swaying back and forth like a forest tree. And then you hear that, instead of getting a large sum for such an achievement, these men, taking it through the year, get scarcely more than ordinary workmen's wages. And I will be continuing with section 2. How they blew off the top of a steeple with dynamite. Known over all Connecticut was the Congregational Church in Hartford that stood for years on Pearl Street and was famous alike for the burning words spoken beneath its roof and the tall, straight spire that reached above it, 238 feet measured, that dropped from cross to pavement. But churches passed like other things, and near the century end came the decision by landowners and lease interpreters that this graceful length of brownstone and the pile beneath it must move off the premises, which meant, of course, that the steeple must come down, the time appointed for this demolition being August 1899. Now, the taking down of a steeple 238 feet high that rises on a closely built city street is not so simple a proceeding as might at first appear. If you suggest pulling the steeple over, all the neighbors cry out. They wish to know where it is going to strike. Are you sure it won't smash down on their housetops? Can you make a steeple fall this way or that way, as woodmen make trees fall? How do you know you can? Besides, how are you going to hitch fast the rope that will pull it over? And who will climb with such a rope to the steeple top? It must be said that there is usually some young man at hand, some daredevil character of the vicinity, who is ready to try the thing and is positive he can succeed at it. But, luckily, he seldom gets a chance to try. "It's queer," said Merrill, telling me the story, "how people ever built a steeple like this one without a window in it, or an air passage, or anything for ventilation. Between the bell deck and the cross there wasn't a single opening from the inside out, so I had to break my way through up near the top. What a place for a man to work, squeezed in the point of a stifling funnel, with no swing for his hammer, and no air to breathe, and the scorch of an August sun. After 15 minutes of it, my wrists and temples would be pounding so I'd have to come down and rest. Of course, the purpose of this hole that I knocked through the steeple top was to make fast ropes and pulleys, so my partner and I could hoist ourselves along the outside and not have to climb up the inside crossbeams, which, I can tell you, is a lively bit of athletics. Well, we got our ropes fixed all right, about 25 feet below the top, and the bosun saddle swung below for us to travel up and down in, and then we made fast another set of ropes and pulleys, about 15 feet higher up. This was for hoisting timber and stuff that we needed. "How did you get up that 15 feet?" I inquired. "Worked up on the stirrups, that is, 2 nooses around the steeple, each ending in a loop, one for the right foot, one for the left. You stand in the right stirrup and work the left loop up. Then you stand in the left stirrup and work the right loop up. Sometimes in hard places you have to throw your nooses around the shaft as a cowboy casts a rope. Come down some day and watch us work. You'll see the whole thing." To this invitation I gave glad acceptance. I certainly wished to see this stirrup climbing process. "The next thing," continued Merrill, "was to make another hole in the steeple through a keystone a little below our first hole. In this hole we set a block of Norway pine resting on an iron jack. The block was about a foot square and 22 inches high, a big tough piece, you see, and by screwing up the jack we could make that part as solid as the keystone was. We made this hole on the east side of the steeple, which was the side we wanted her to fall on, the only side she could fall on without injuring something, and we had it figured out so close that we dug a trench on that side straight out from the steeple's base, 10 feet wide and 4 feet deep, and told people we intended to have the whole top of that steeple, say a length of 35 feet and a weight of 35 tons. Come off at one time and land right square in that trench and nowhere else. That's what we intended to do. Now began the hoisting of materials. First a lot of half-inch wire cable, enough for 4 turns around the steeple. Then 8 16-foot timbers, 2 inches thick and a foot wide. Then a lot of maple wedges. We bandaged the steeple with the cable and drew it tight with tackle. Then we lowered the timbers lengthwise inside the cable, which we could do because the steeple was an octagon with ornamented corners, and these left spaces where the wire rope was stretched around. Then we wedged fast the 8 timbers so that they formed a 16-foot half-collar on the west side of the steeple, just opposite our hole where the jack was. In other words, we had the steeple shored in so that when we let her go, no loose stones could fall on the west side. Everything must fall to the east. Last of all, we widened our hole on the east side, stripping away stones until that whole side lay open in a half-circular mouth about 4 feet high, and in this mouth were 2 teeth, one might say, that held the stone jaws apart, the iron jack biting into the block of Norway pine. On those two now came the steeple's weight, or, anyhow, one half of it. To knock out one of these teeth would be to leave the east side of the steeple unsupported, with the result that it may topple over in that direction and fall to the ground. Anyway, that was our reasoning, and it seemed sound enough. The only question was how we were going to knock out that block of Norway pine. Well, the day of the test came, and I guess 5,000 people were there to see what would happen. Everybody was discussing it, and farmers had driven in for miles, just as they do for a hanging. You understand, I was under the orders of the contractor, and he had his own plan about getting the block out. He proposed to hitch a rope to it, drop this rope to a donkey engine in the yard, and set the engine winding up the rope. He said the block would have to come out then and the steeple fall. I agreed that the block might come out, but was afraid it would tip up, through the strain coming at an angle, and throw the steeple over to the west, just the way we didn't want it to go. And if that steeple ever fell to the west, there was no telling how many people it would kill in the crowd, without counting damages to houses. However, the contractor was boss, and he stuck to his way. His way was right. So we hitched the engine to the block and set her going. She puffed and tugged a little, and then snapped the rope. We got another rope, and she broke that too. Then we got a stronger rope, and the engine just kicked herself around the yard and had lots of fun, but the block never budged. All that morning, we tried one scheme after another to make that engine pull the block out, but we might as well have hitched a rope to the church. The steeple's weight was too much for us, and all the time the crowd was getting bigger and bigger, until the police could hardly manage it. Finally, the contractor, being very mad and quite anxious, said he'd be hanged if he could get the block out, and for me to try my scheme, and do it quick, for some men were going about saying the thing was dangerous and ought to be stopped. He didn't have to speak twice before I was on my way up that steeple, carrying an inch auger, a 50-foot fuse, and a stick of dynamite. I'd had them ready for hours. It's queer how people get wind of a thing. The crowd seemed to know in a minute that I was going to use dynamite, and before I was 20 feet up the ladder, a police officer was after me, ordering me down. I went right ahead, pretending not to hear, and when I got to the bell deck, he was puffing along 10 yards below me. I swung into my bosun saddle and began pulling myself up outside the steeple, and I guess the whole 5,000 people around the church bent back their heads to watch me. As soon as I began to rise in the saddle, I knew I was all right, for I coiled up the hauling line on my arm so the officer couldn't follow me. All he could do was stand on the bell deck and gape after me like the rest and growl. When I reached the block, I bored a 6-inch hole into her at a downward slant, and in this I put some crumbs of dynamite, not much, only about half a teaspoonful, and then I stuck in the fuse and hammered her solid with sand. Then I lit the other end, dropped it down inside the steeple, and slid down the rope as fast as I could, yelling to the officer that I'd touched her off. You ought to have seen him get out of that steeple. He never waited to arrest me or anything. He had pressing business on the ground. By the time I got down, you could see a little trail of bluish smoke drifting away from the hole, and there was a hush over the crowd, except for the police trying to make them stand back behind the ropes. I don't know as I ever saw a bigger crowd. The street was jammed for blocks either way. Well, sir, that was a queer-acting fuse. It smoked and smoked for about 10 minutes, and then the smoke stopped. The people began to laugh. They said it had gone out, and the contractor was nearly crazy. He was sure I had made another failure. I didn't know what to think. I just waited. We waited 10 minutes, 12 minutes. It seemed like an hour, but nobody dared go up to see what the matter was. Then, suddenly, the explosion came. No louder than a pistol crack, for dynamite isn't noisy, but it stirred me more than a cannon. "Start your engine!" I shouted, and the little dummy had just time to wind up half a turn of the hitch line when the old steeple-top swayed and broke clean in two, right where the block was, and the whole upper length fell like one piece, fell to the east, just as we had planned it, and landed in the trench, every stone of it. There wasn't a piece as big as your fingernail, sir, outside that trench, and while she was falling, I don't know how many kodaks were snapped in the hope of getting a picture. Men and women with cameras had been waiting for hours on the roofs of high buildings, and 2 or 3 of them actually caught a picture of the steeple-top as it hung in the air for a fraction of a second at right angles to the base. Speaking of which, here is a photograph of the steeple-top falling. It says, "The old steeple swayed and broke clean in two, right where the block was, and the whole upper length fell like one piece, fell to the east just as we had planned it." So, yeah, I really hope that this illustration just helps to bring that sense of awe and excitement from that moment. And I will be continuing with section 3. The greatest danger to a steeple climber lies in being startled. It appears that professional steeple climbers are quiet-mannered men, with a certain gentleness of voice, like deaf people, that impresses one far more than any strident boasting. This habit of silence they form from being silent so much aloft, and when they do speak, it is in a low tone, because that is the least startling to a man as he swings over some reeling gulf, next to an actual disaster, which usually kills outright and painlessly. What a steeple climber most dreads is being startled. This was explained to me in one of our mini talks by Steeple Bob, famous over the land for daring feats, but never reckless ones. How plainly I call up his pale, serious face, and the massive shoulders, somewhat bent, and the forearm with muscles to impress a prize fighter. Pleasant to note that Merrill uses excellent English. Did you ever have an impulse to jump off a steeple? I questioned, recalling the sensations of many people in looking down, even from a housetop. I've kept pretty free from that, said he, but there is no doubt climbing steeples does tell on a man's nerves. Now, there was Dan O'Brien. He had an impulse to jump off a steeple one day, and a strong impulse, too. He went mad on one of the tallest spires in Cincinnati, right at the top of it. Went mad? Yes, sir. Raving mad, and I was by him when it happened. I forget whether the church was Baptist or Presbyterian, but I know it stood on 6th Street, near Vine, and there was a big hand on top of the steeple, with the forefinger pointing to heaven. We were putting fresh gilding on this hand. I was working on the thumb side, and O'Brien on the little finger side, both of us standing on tiny stagings about the size of a chair seat, and both of us made fast to the steeple by lifelines under our arms. That's an absolute rule in climbing steeples, never to do the smallest thing unless you're secured by a lifeline. It was coming on dark, and I was hurrying to get the gold leaf on, because we'd given the hand a fresh coat of sizing that would be dry before morning. We hadn't spoken for some time, when suddenly I heard a laugh from O'Brien's side that sent a shiver down my spine. Did you ever hear a crazy man laugh? Well, if ever you do, you'll remember it. I looked at him and saw by his face that something was wrong. What are you doing? Said I. He answered very polite and steady-like, but his tone was queer. I'm trying to figure out how long it would take a man to get down if he went the fastest way. I thought I had better keep him in a good humor, so I said, I'll tell you what, Dan, you brace up and get this gold on, and then we'll race to the ground in our saddles. That's a fair idea, said he in a shrill voice, but I've got a better one. We'll race down without any saddles, yes, sir, without any lines, without a blamed thing. Don't be a fool, Dan. What you want to do is to get that gold on. Quick, I tried to speak sharp. No, sir, I'm going to jump, and so are you. I caught his eye just then, and saw it wasn't any time to bother about gold leaf. I reached up and eased the hitch of my line around the hand so I could swing toward him. I knew if I once got my grip on him, he wouldn't make any more trouble. But I'd never had a crazy man to deal with, and I didn't realize how tricky and quick they are. While I was working around to his side and thinking he didn't notice it, he was laying for me out of the corner of his eye, and the first thing I knew, he had me by the throat, and everything was turning black. I let go of the line and dropped back on my saddleboard helpless, and if it hadn't been for blind luck, I guess the people down below would have got their money's worth in about a minute. But my hand struck on the toolbox as he pressed me back, and I had just strength enough left to shut my fingers on the first tool I touched and strike at him with it. The tool happened to be a monkey wrench, and when a man gets a clip on the head with a thing like that, he's pretty apt to keep still for a while, and that's what O'Brien did. He keeled over and lay there, and I did too, until my head got steady. Even then, I guess we'd both have fallen if it hadn't been for the lifelines. The rest was simple enough after I got my senses back. Dan was unconscious, and all I had to do was fasten a rope to him and lower away. They took care of him down below until the ambulance came, and he spent that night in a hospital. And he spent most of his years since then in an asylum, his mind all gone except for short periods, when he comes to himself again, and then he always starts out to put an end to me. That last impulse to destroy me has never left him. It was after this that I learned about the that other danger to steeple-climbers, of being startled. Merrill says that men of his craft, whether they realize it or not, work under constant nervous strain. However calm a steeple-climber may think himself, his body is always afraid, his muscles are always tense, his clutch on ropes and stones is always harder, 2 or 3 times harder, than the need is. His knees hug what comes between them so tightly that it hurts, even when they might safely be relaxed. That is the trouble. A steeple-climber cannot relax his body or control its instinctive shrinking. It is not looking down into the gulf around him that he minds. The climber who cannot do that with indifference is unfit for the business. What he sees he can cope with. It is what he cannot see that does the mischief, what he fears vaguely, and a sudden noise, an unexpected movement may throw him into all but panic. So the veteran climber, swinging at the steeple-top opposite his partner, is careful to say in a low tone, "I'm going to lower my saddle before he does lower it," or "I'm going to strike a match before he strikes it." Sometimes a new helper at the hauling line down on the bell deck will shift his place from weariness or thoughtlessness, and let the line move up an inch or two, which drops the saddle an inch or two far aloft, drops it suddenly with a jerk. It's a little thing, yet the climber's heart would not pound harder were the whole steeple falling. Merrill told me that one of his greatest frights came from the simple brushing against his legs of a rope pulled without a word by a careless partner. To Merrill's nerves, all a-quiver, this was not a rope, but some nameless catastrophe to overwhelm him. He knew only that something had moved where nothing had any business to move, that something had touched him where nothing was. A steeple-climber is like a child in the dark, and terror of the unknown. In all the world, perhaps, there is no one so utterly alone as he, swinging hour after hour on his steeple-top. The aeronaut has with him a living, surging creature, his balloon. The diver feels always the teeming life of the waters, but this man, lifted into still air, poised on a point where nothing hums or goes, where nothing moves, where nothing makes a sound, he, in very truth, is alone. "It's always the little things that frighten you," reflected Merrill, "not the big things. I'll give you an instance. When I went up inside St. Paul's steeple the first time, I wanted to inspect the beams and see how the dowel was anchored. I got into a tight place that might well frighten a man. I got squeezed fast between timbers that fill nearly all the slender top space, and couldn't get up or down, but just hung there, breathing air full of dust and calling for help. I called 3/4 of an hour before anyone came, and then it was only by accident. But I wasn't frightened. On the other hand, a day or 2 later, when I was making fast a rope outside, I was just under the ball that holds the weather vane. I got a bad start from nothing at all. I had my arms around the spindle of the steeple, making a hitch, and my head pressed against the copper sheathing, when I heard a most unearthly screech. I guess the shock of that thing did me $500 worth of harm, shortened my life days enough to earn $500 in. And what do you think it was? The weather vane had turned a little in the wind and creaked on its bearings. That's all. It doesn't seem as if that ought to scare a man, does it? There was something quite touching, I thought, in the humble frankness of this big-shouldered man. Yes, he had been afraid, he whose business it was to fear nothing, afraid of some squeaking copper, and his face seemed to say that there are things about steeples not so easily explained, things not even to be talked about, and abruptly, as by an effort, he left this part of the subject and told a funny story of his adventures coming home late one night without a key, and getting in by way of the roof and an iron pipe, a simple enough climb had he not been taken for a burglar by an irate German lodger, who appeared in nightgown and phlegmatic fright, and vowed he would have him a revolver, a skelf-shooter, in the morning. This effort at diversion turned Merrill into gaiety for a moment, but straightway memory brought back the somber theme. "I'll give you another case," said he, changing again abruptly, "where I wasn't frightened, but should have been. It was out in Chicago, and 2 of us were on a staging hung down the front of a clothing factory. We were painting the walls. My partner had made his end of the staging fast, and I had made mine fast. Perhaps if I'd been longer in the business, I would have taken more notice how he'd secured his rope, for it meant safety to me as well as him, and I knew he'd been drinking, but I supposed it was all right. Well, it wasn't all right. His rope held for 3 or 4 hours, and then, at just about 11 o'clock, it slipped, and the staging fell from under us. We were 6 stories up, and right below were the sidewalk flagstones. That's the time I ought to have been frightened, but I only said to myself, "Hello, this thing's going down," and caught the window ledge in front of me. Then I hung there, wondering if I could pull myself up, or if anyone would come to help me. I called out not very loud, and I wasn't excited. Pretty soon I saw I couldn't pull myself up, for I had a poor hold with my fingers, and the ledge was smooth stone. Then I saw they'd have to hurry if they were going to pull me in. Then I didn't care. You fell, he nodded. What? 6 stories down? He nodded again. The thing that saved me was an awning over the sidewalk. Some man across the way saw me hanging from the window, and he ran over quickly and let the awning down. I'd like to shake that man by the hand, but I never knew who he was. When I came to myself, I was at the hospital, done up in plaster, and I stayed there 9 months. Badly hurt? I asked, shrinking. Merrill smiled. It didn't do me any particular good. I'm a big, strong fellow now, but I wasn't much after that fall. Both my legs were broken. Both my arms were broken. My right shoulder and right wrist were dislocated and, let's see, oh yes, had 3 ribs torn away from the breastbone. My partner? Poor lad. You wouldn't care to hear how they found him. They laid him away kindly the next day. He smiled in a sort of appealing way, and then came the worn, wistful look I had noticed, and his forehead lines deepened. I fancy all men who follow steeple climbing get those strained, anxious eyes. Okay, and that is the end of part 3 of this section. Section 4 of the Steeple-Climber. Experience of an amateur climbing to a steeple top. It came to my knowledge one bracing day in October that Steeple Bob had agreed to do that famous Brooklyn Church of the Pilgrims, with its queer, crooked spire and big brass ball, a landmark from the river on Columbia Heights. "It's one of those easy jobs that are the hardest," said Merrill. "If you want to see us use the stirrups, come over." That was exactly what I did want to see, this puzzling stirrup process, which allows a man to lift himself by his bootstraps, as it were, up the last and narrowest and most dangerous length of a steeple, so I agreed to be there. "If you like, you can go up on the swing yourself," said Merrill, with the air of conferring a favor. I expressed my thanks as I would to a lion tamer offering me the hospitality of his cages, then asked how he meant that easy jobs are the hardest. "Why, easy jobs make a man careless, and that gets him into trouble. Another thing, little old churches look easy, but they're apt to be treacherous. Now, this steeple in the Church of the Pilgrims is built of wood, with loose shingles on it, and a tumble-down iron lightning rod, and rickety beams, and shaky ladders, and, well, you feel all the time as if you were walking on eggs. It's just the kind of a steeple that killed young Romaine about a month ago. Of course, I asked for the story of young Romaine, and was told of certain climbers who advertise their skill by using a steeple-top for acrobatic feats that have nothing to do with preparing. Upon such Merrill frowned severely. "Romaine was a fine athlete," said he, "and a fearless man, but he went too far. He would stretch out on his stomach across the top of a steeple, and balance there without touching hands or knees, and he'd do all sorts of circus tricks on lightning rods, and weather vanes, and flagpoles, anything for notoriety. I told him he'd get killed for sure some day, but he laughed at me. Well, it wasn't a week after I warned him when he was killed. He climbed an old lightning rod without testing it. It was on a little church up at Cold Spring, New York, and just as he was reaching the steeple top, with the whole town watching him, the end of the rod pulled out, and he swung off with it, ripping out every dowel, like the buttons off a coat, right down to the ground. Smash! Poor fellow! When I read the news, I left my job at Trinity and took the first train up to bury him." This sad story lingered in my mind that night, and was there still the next afternoon as I drew near the Church of the Pilgrims to witness the first day's climbing. Already, at a distance, I knew that the men were at work from the upbent heads of people on the street who stared and pointed. And presently I made out 2 white figures on the steeple, one swinging about 15 feet below the ball, the other standing against the shingled side without any support that I could see. Up the old tower, inside, I made my way, and 2 ladders beyond the bell deck came upon Walter Tiggy, Steeple Bob's assistant, astride of a stone saddle on one of the Up the old tower, inside, I made my way, and 2 ladders beyond the bell deck came upon Walter Tiggy, Steeple Bob's assistant, astride of a stone saddle on one of the 4 peaks where the tower ends and the steeple begins. There was a clear drop of 100 feet all around him. He was tending but the 2 men aloft, as witnessed a couple of ropes dangling by him. It was 2 jerks to come down and 1 to go up. Were he to lose his balance and let go the hauling rope, the men on the swing would instantly be killed, as they had no lock blocks on. "Come out here," said Walter. "There's plenty of room." And, thus encouraged, I straddled the peak, and we sat face to face, as 2 men might sit on a child's rocking horse, while the tower pigeons circled beneath us, alarmed at this intrusion. Far down on the sidewalk were little faces of distorted people. Far up at the steeple top were legs kicking at ropes, and off over red housetops was the river, and the great towers of New York spread with silver plumes by the steam jets. "Now you can see the stirrups working," said Walter, and, looking up, I saw a figure swing back from the steeple, an arm shoot out, and a length of rope go wriggling around the shaft, cast like a lasso. Then the rope was drawn into a noose, and the noose hauled tight. The legs kicked, the figure hitched itself up about a foot, and again the rope was cast. Another rope, and a second noose still higher made secure. That is all there is to it. The steeple-climber stands in a stirrup, held by 1 noose, while he lassos the shaft above him with another noose, supporting another stirrup on which he presently stands. And so, foot by foot, the climber rises, shifting noose and stirrup at each change, resting now on one, now on the other, and finally reaching the cross or ball or weather vane at the very top. "That's Joe Lawler's chugging the rope," explained Walter. "Merrill, he's on the swing. Say, Lawler's a wonder at rigging. He can do anything with ropes. He's the feller that climbs up the front of a house with suckers on his feet." Of this fact I took note, and then inquired if I couldn't get up farther inside the steeple, so as to be nearer the men. Walter said I could climb ladders up to where they had punched a hole through for the rope to hold the blocks. Walter said I could climb ladders up to where they had punched a hole through for the rope to hold the block and falls, and I tried it. Alas, when I got there, after breathing dust and squeezing between beams, I found that I could see nothing. I was almost at the steeple top, and could hear Merrill through the wooden shell humming a tune as he worked, but I was farther away than before. "Hello in there," came a voice. "Don't monkey with that line." And it came to me that this rope, reaching down by me from yonder little hole, the one knocked through, held the block which held the swing which held the men, and an accident to this rope would mean instant death. I touched it and drew my hand away, as one might touch some animal through the cage bars, and I felt like saying, "Good little rope." It was coming on to dark now, and we all went home together, over the bridge and up the avenues, talking of steeples the while, and Lawler explained the action of his suckers in climbing walls, which is precisely that of a boy sucker in lifting a brick. The big climbing leathers, well soaked in oil, are pressed alternately against the stones, the right leg resting on one, while the left leg presses the other against the wall a step higher, and so you walk right up the building or church or flagpole, and the smoother the surface, the easier you go up. In fact, if the surface is rough, you cannot use the suckers at all, as the air gets under and prevents their holding. Then the men spoke of various jobs aloft that called up memories. Merrill told of cleaning the 15-foot Diana statue on the Madison Square Garden Tower. "It's hard getting over her," he said, "because she's so blamed smooth. I guess I took 3 quarts of rust out of her ball bearings. You know she's a weather vane, and turns with the wind. I wondered how many New Yorkers who see the Diana every day of their lives have ever dwelt on the fact that she turns." Talking of weather vanes reminded my friends of a ticklish job they did on St. Paul's steeple in New York, when Merrill, standing under the ball, held Lawler on his giant shoulders so that Joe could lift off the weather vane on top and ease the shaft where it had jammed. With Lawler's weight and the weather vane's weight, Steeple Bob held 400 pounds on his shoulders during those important minutes, and, it might almost be said, stood on the dizzy edge of nothing while he did it. Finally, Lawler expressed the opinion that there isn't any meaner job in the business than a chimney. "A chimney," said I. That's what. I mean, one of them big ones you see on factories. We have to scrape him and paint him just like steeples, and that means climbing up the whole length inside. The climbing's easy enough on bolts and braces, but it's something fierce, the air you breathe. Why, I've gone up a 240-foot chimney with a 5-foot opening at the bottom, and found the soot so thick about halfway up, so thick, sir, that I've been almost stuck in it. Yes, sir, just had to shove my head into an 1/8-inch hole and bore through black stuff, beds of it, and mind, not a hole for air as big as a pinhead from bottom to top. After bidding the man good night, I reflected, with a kind of shame, that I had drawn back from daring only once what they dare every day, what they must dare for their living, and I reasoned myself into a feeling that it was my duty under the circumstances to go up that steeple on the swing, as Merrill had proposed. Having begun this investigation, I must see it through, and in this mind I went to the church again the next day. I found all hands on the bell deck, spreading out packets of patent gilding for the ball which awaited its new dress, all sticky from a fresh coat of sizing. Lala remarked that there was better gold in these little yellow squares than in a wedding ring. "It's 24 carats fine," said he, "and about as thick as a cobweb." As to my going up on the swing, there was no difficulty. Lawler would go first, and be there to keep me in good heart, and for they say it is not well for a novice to be at a steeple-top alone. Merrill would see to the lashings, and Walter would give a hand at the hauling line. Thus all conditions favored my ascent. Even the sun smiled, and after taking off coat and hat I was ready. There we were, at the top of the tower and at the base of the steeple, Lawler, red-faced and red-shirted, preparing to ascend. Merrill, pale as he always is, but powerful, standing at the ropes, and I, in shirt-sleeves and bareheaded, watching Walter make a little harness for my kodak. After a time, Lawler, having reached the top, called down something, and Merrill answered. It was my turn now. I climbed out through a small window and stood on the ledge, while Steeple Bob dropped the swing noose over my head and proceeded to lash me fast to seat and ropes. That's in case a suicidal impulse should get hold of you," he said, smiling but meaning it. "Now, keep this rope between your legs, and work your hands up along it as we lift you. It's anchored to St. Peter." Then he explained how I was to press my toes against the steeple side, so as to keep my knees from barking on the shingles. "And don't look down at all," he told me. "Just watch your ropes and take it easy. Are you ready?" At this moment, Walter said something in a low tone, and Merrill asked me to lend him my knife. I handed it out, and he stuck it in his pocket. "You don't need this now," said he, and a moment later the pulley ropes tightened, and my small swingboard lifted under me. I was rising. "Shove off there with your toes," he cried. "Take short steps. Put your legs wider apart. Wider yet. You don't have to pull on the rope. Just slide your hands along. Now you're going." I saw nothing but the steeple side in front of me, and the lifeline hanging down like a bell rope between my spread legs, and the pulley block creaking by my head, and the toes of my shoes as I pressed them against the shingle step by step. It struck me as a ridiculous thing to be climbing a steeple in patent leather shoes. I smiled to think of the odd appearance I must present from below. And then, for the first time, I let my eyes turn into the depths and caught a glimpse of men on housetops watching me. I saw Merrill's upturned face down where the ropes ended, and I saw little horses wriggling along on the street. There were 3 places where the steeple narrowed into slender lengths, and at each one was a sort of cornice to be scrambled over, and loose nails to be avoided, and then more careful steering with legs and toes to keep on one particular face of the steeple and not swing off and come bumping back, a disconcerting possibility. "Hello!" called Lawler presently from above. "You're doing fine. Come right along." And before I knew it, the swing had stopped. I was at the top, or as near it as the tackle could take me. The remaining 15 feet or so must be made with stirrups, and there was Lawler standing in them, up by the ball. There was not a stick of staging to support him. He had scorned the bother of hauling up boards for so simple a job, and he was working with both hands free, each leg standing on its stirrup, and several hitches of lifeline holding him to the shaft top by his waist. This steeple lassoing exploit was one of the things I certainly would not attempt, would not and could not. Strangely enough, as I hung here at rest, I felt the danger more than coming up. It seemed most perilous to rest my weight on this wing board, and I found myself holding my legs drawn up, with muscles tense, as if that could make me lighter. Gradually, I realized the foolishness of this, and relaxed into greater comfort, but not entirely. Even veteran steeple-climbers waste much strength in needless clutching, cannot free their bodies from this instinctive fear. I stayed up long enough to take 3 photographs. Some minutes passed before I could unlash my Kodak, and here I had further proof of subconscious fright, for I made such blunders with shutter and focus length as would put the youngest amateur to shame. 2 pictures out of the 3 were failures, and the third but an indifferent success. There is one thing to be said in extenuation, that a steeple is never still, but always rocking and trembling. When Lawler changed his stirrup hitches, or moved from side to side, the old beams would groan under us, and the whole structure rock. "She'd rock more," said Lawler, "if she was better built. A good steeple always rocks." There wasn't much more to say or do up here, and presently we exchanged jerks on the line for the descent, and Lawler cried, "Lower away! Hang on now!" And I did over again my humble part of leg spreading and toe steering, with the result that presently I was down on the bell deck again, receiving congratulations. "Here's your knife," said Merrill, after he had unlashed me. What did you take it for?" I asked. "Oh, men sometimes get a mania to cut the ropes when they go up the first time, and that isn't good for their health. I was pretty sure you'd keep your head, but I wasn't taking any chances." After this came thanks and warm handy grips all around. And then I left these daring men to their duties, and went down the lower ladders. I'm sure I never appreciated the simple privilege of standing on a sidewalk as I did a few minutes later, when I left the Church of the Pilgrims and came out into the pleasant sunshine. Thank you for listening to The Steeple-Climber by Cleveland Moffett with me, and I will show you the photograph again of the old steeple swing. I hope that you enjoyed this story and that you're having a great day. Bye!